One of my favorite things in the Catholic intellectual tradition is this notion of evil as privation.
Mm.
That evil isn't a something, but it's the absence of a good that God intended to be there. But in theoretical terms, a sin isn't something that you do. A sin is a failure to do a good that God intended for you to do.
Mm-hmm. All right, welcome back, everyone. Craig here, no Jonah, but I have a guest. I think what's going to be a very interesting interview, Jonathan Heaps. I hope I pronounced that right. Jonathan, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, family, anything like that, and then let's start talking.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much for having me. I am the director of the Bernard Lonergan Institute at Seton Hall University. I'm still pretty new in the role. I've been here about a year now. I have a doctorate in theology from Marquette University, where I worked with one of the major Lonergan scholars, a guy named Robert Dorn, who passed a couple of years ago. And before that, I got a master's in philosophy from Boston College. So I'm sort of one of these borderland people between the two disciplines. So I like sort of interdisciplinary stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a convert, as they say. I became Catholic in 2017 after the joke. Well, it's only half a joke, but after the birth of my second daughter, I decided I wanted to be Catholic longer than someone in my family, and so I was received in the Saturday evening mass, and she was baptized the next morning. So, but then we had a third kid, and
Yeah.
So it was obviated, but. Yeah, what else about me? I grew up sort of low church, pietist evangelical in a tradition called the Evangelical Covenant Church in California. And I was a young, earnest Christian kid who had a lot of questions. And when I went to college, I went to North Park University, which is the university that is owned and operated by that denomination. And it just so happened that all my philosophy professors had doctorates from Jesuit schools. So I got a very Catholic intellectual tradition philosophy education at my little evangelical school. So there were certain seeds sown then. But yeah.
Well, that's interesting because I was having flashbacks to is it Jordan Daniel Woods? Do you know?
I know Jordan.
Yeah, we interviewed him probably a month or so ago, and if I recall correctly, he too was down the path. I forget if his
Disciples of Christ, I think, or one of the Stone Campbell movement, I think, is Jordan's background. I have a bunch of colleagues I went to grad school who were co-religionists with him.
Yeah,
in the day.
And he was well into the journey of, I don't know if it was philosophy or theology before he became Catholic. And so for you would have had your BA, and so you would have had your master's in philosophy at Boston College. And how about your theology? I assume came after you became Catholic?
I was dissertating by the time I was received. Yeah. I had a lot of friends and colleagues in undergraduate who had their own evangelical horizon kind of exploded by their own questions in the course of their college experience. And a number of them quite quickly found their way into some into the Roman Catholic Church, some into the Antiochian Orthodox Church here and there. And I sort of dragged my feet really with the intention of sort of filling my arms with the riches of the Catholic intellectual tradition and going back home to my tradition. And, it kind of turned out in some ways that in the intervening decade or so, by the time I kind of started thinking about heading back into that community and that world, the culture of the denomination had changed in some ways. And some of the some of the values of it, I think, had shifted. It's a tradition that, at least when I was growing up, was not anti-intellectual at all. I mean, people were very positive on the fact that I had challenging questions and were very affirmative of that. But they didn't have it was a rural house church pietist kind of post-Lutheran movement, and they didn't have like their own institutions really in which to keep up a robust kind of intellectual traditions and resources. I mean, there were some things there, but it was a little bit of a shallow pool to draw from in some ways. And kind of by the time I went back, some of that, some of the atmospheric evangelical anti-intellectualism seemed to have kind of seeped in a little bit. And then there were biographical things for me too, which is that I married a nice half Mexican Catholic girl from Texas, and that'll change your calculus pretty fast too.
Yeah. I was assuming without asking necessarily that if your wife was Catholic. So
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm really fascinated by what you just said, where you and other people from a non-Catholic perspective wrestled with questions, and for some of those people found their way into Catholicism. What is, if you had to like summarize, and everyone's a little different, but what's at the core of the struggles that people in that circle have, that they find Catholicism as, this is attractive to me, this fills a void that I have not been able to fill before?
I sometimes I will sometimes say about the Evangelical Covenant Church's culture, again, at least when I was growing up, it wasn't anti-intellectual, and so they were happy to field your questions, and it was quite doctrinally minimalist. I mean, my sort of joke is that you could fit their doctrinal statement on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper in like size 14 font.
Yeah.
I mean, it really was like the Trinity, incarnation. I mean, really good sort of dogmatic base, but now we consider sort of dogmatic basics. And then beyond that, there was a real willingness to be like, so then like grab your Bible and we'll talk. And I think partly what happened is that the sufficiency of the Bible. I mean, remember, it's a post-Lutheran movement, so there's a certain sola scriptura ethos, and the sufficiency of just looking at the text of the Bible to answer difficult questions didn't hold up, I think, for a lot of people. I want to be generous to their spiritual experience, but I think for a lot of folks, there was a certain element of a crisis of authority, where the sufficiency of Scripture to serve that authoritative role was undermined, and consequently, they then went in search of other foundations, and some found it in the ancient, the claims to ancientness in the Orthodox Church of the liturgy. Some people really found it there. They just said, they shifted their sort of ground from Scripture to liturgy. And in evangelical circles, there was a kind of recovering of liturgy at that time. I think James K. Smith at Calvin had written a book kind of using liturgy as a big category, and that was very influential. And then for others of us, I think it was the philosophical resources, the sort of Catholic intellectual tradition resources we grabbed hold of, and then if you really needed a kind of further bedrock, there was the sort of magisterial authority of the church itself. I don't know. I hope I'm being fair to those people if they end up listening to this. I hope they recognize their own experience in what I just said. But
so, of course, this is somewhat anecdotal from your own experience, but I'm curious then, what's the retention rate of people that start there, become Catholic, and how many of them at some point in time, maybe the luster wears off and they're like, I'm going back, or I'm going to go in a total different direction? Can you comment on that at all?
I don't know. I couldn't say. I suspect pretty high, honestly. I suspect pretty high. Now, for a number of us, we were academically minded. And so in one way or another, our professional lives also ended up being tied up with our movement between church affiliations. And so, I can think of one fellow I know who's the principal of a Catholic school, another guy who is a professor of theology. And so, I can kind of go through and I think there's a pretty high, a pretty good record, as you might say, a pretty good average. But again, I think for a lot of those people, they're also kind of professionally invested in it as well, in addition to being personally and spiritually connected there. But again, I don't know how much light I can shed on that.
Yeah, just so my co-host and I are Cradle Catholics. I kind of sort of describe myself as more of a revert, in that we were kind of nominal Catholics until I was in my teen years, and then kind of our whole family went through this. Faith became very seriously. We started praying, and then we ended up in the sort of the traditional Latin Mass community, and was there for a while. My family's more or less stayed there. I consider myself a recovering traditionalist, not as to cast stones against traditionalism, but there was elements of that that I just didn't work for me. And part of that, and again, I don't mean to pick on the trad so much, but there seems to be an element of this anti-intellectualism. I don't know if it's the same as what you're describing in your evangelical roots, but we get this podcast is a little different than most. Like we're Catholic, we're trying to be Catholic, good Catholics, but we probably ask questions or make comments that a lot of people would not feel comfortable saying out loud, and so we get a lot of pushback from people saying, well, this is what the church says, how dare you think otherwise? And I don't know what the right path there is, but it seems to me that the one thing that's really authentically Catholic is our intellectualism, our willingness and ability to grapple with things and test our teachings against questions. And so for me, that is what has helped keep me grounded. But it's hard. I
used to go home to the church I grew up at during college, and I would tell people I was a philosophy major, and they would express concern that I could be a philosophy major and keep my faith, and I could never quite communicate to them that no, you don't understand. The deepening of my understanding and the deepening of my questions I'm getting in philosophy is integral to me keeping my faith. That if I didn't have these resources, I would have chucked this. I couldn't, with authenticity, live in the old horizon as I've grown and had new questions and new experiences. But I also have sympathy for that. Their concern was well meant.
Yeah. No, I totally get that, and I try to be sensitive to that. Like I don't want to be imprudent or careless, and God forbid we don't want to lead anyone astray, but we don't proclaim to have answers. We really just kind of talk about things and ask questions, and hopefully that's something that is something we can do as Catholics. And so I'm curious then if you can comment on this at all. Because our show focuses a lot on sort of the Catholic sexual morality and the diverse approaches to that, and the challenges that people have, whether it's with natural family planning, contraception, whether you should even be using natural family planning. I mean, there's a movement saying, well, basically you have to have an extraordinary reason to not be just having kids all the time. And so there's these different approaches to it. And one of the things that we commiserate about is in the struggle as Catholics is that there seems to be this endless checklist of things you have to do or things you better avoid. And every one of them is a grave matter and potentially jeopardizing your soul. And so that's why we spend a lot of time talking about that, and we sometimes wonder, wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have quite so many rules and it was a little more let the couple
Yeah.
kind of discern
Yeah.
some of these things? Is
Sure.
that, can you speak to that a little bit? Compare and contrast Catholicism with, let's say, more of the evangelical circles you were in.
Yeah. I mean, there is in some evangelical circles, there is an unfortunate tendency to have a very kind of high anxiety, very intense set of absolutist sexual ethic
Mhm.
about sex outside of marriage.
Mhm.
And then once you get inside, and then once you're within the sort of bounds of wedlock, like no guidance.
Yeah.
Um, and all kinds of bad behavior can crop up
Mhm.
in that
Mhm.
framework. You don't have the same, and then also, right, you don't have the same set of doctrinal or even sort of speculative intellectual scaffolds to think about the relationship, for example, between marriage and procreation necessarily. Now there are some, there's like the full quiver movement and stuff, and you see sort of Protestant versions of that. But at least my experience was one where really it was pretty unstructured. So it's sort of, in some ways, it's a defect in the other direction, of just being like, yeah, and then once you're married, like you kids have fun, and
Yeah.
like, and then you hope at some point that maybe people either have good healthy friendships or healthy or find some kind of therapeutic intervention to avoid whatever pathologies that they bring into the thing together. So yes, I mean it's quite different in that regard. But the sort of to sort of adapt one of Pope Francis's ways of speaking, the sort of pelvic preoccupation is analogous. That it's that you almost never bump into discussions of sins that happen above the belt line, and it's there is a kind of weird. Almost kind of, if you were a Freudian, you'd be excused for having some theories about what's going on in these communities. And I mean, one of my own hobby horses, frankly, both in the wider Christian world and even among Catholics, is that is the use of the sort of euphemism of the adjective orthodox to describe people's positionality, where orthodox means holding a certain set of moral theological positions almost exclusively on sexual matters, and doesn't refer, for example, to the Trinitarian or Christological dogmas. And that strikes me as a deep perversion of what the word orthodox means. It's a significant misweighting of what's really central and what's not peripheral but secondary in terms of Catholic faith and teaching. Anyway, that's one of my hobby horses. That's one of my pet peeves, is when that euphemism gets used. But yeah, it's not just Catholics. That happens in an evangelical world as well.
Well, and I've always I've long wondered why that is. I know some will say, well, original sin just greatly impacted our sexual faculties and desires, and therefore it's loaded with excuse me, temptations and opportunities for sin, and that's where the devil is trying to get us. And so of course we have all these struggles, but but the reality is this kind of stuff is kind of in my face on a daily basis, if not weekly basis, whereas I don't spend a lot of time pondering the Trinity or grappling with that, even though maybe I should be. But what I have found in my own experience, and I've been married for 22 years, is at the times of my life where I was I was throwing everything I had spiritually and mentally at these things, trying to be sort of the perfect person.
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't anything left for anything else. There wasn't mental or spiritual bandwidth left to grow in to read the mystics, to do other things. I was so focused
Yeah.
on channeling this and trying to extend the time before I needed to go to confession again. I mean, and I don't think I'm alone there. I mean, and I think this is probably more of a male issue than a female issue for the most part, but not always. And that's where I really kind of why this podcast started. I was like, this is like, are we supposed to be this fixated on this stuff? And
Mhm.
if we are, okay, but I think we need to warn people a little bit about what they're getting into, because I think marriage as a Catholic is extraordinarily difficult. Well, it's like difficult anyway, but if you really try to be super orthodox or whatever,
Yeah.
at times it feels almost impossible. And that's the thing that we wrestle with as we talk about the realities and how people are going to often fall in one respect or another from the orthodox playlist, and we get accused of consenting to that, or saying it's okay to do those things, when really we're just saying this is what happens. Like, this is what the real life world is like for a Catholic husband and wife. And so I'm yeah, so it's interesting that you kind of have some similar concerns on that. Have you written any papers? You have anything coming out that might be able to shed some light on that, or just maybe you have any thoughts one way or another on that?
Yeah. I mean, well, one thing that so I'm the director of the Bernard Lonergan Institute. I'm a specialist in this Canadian Jesuits philosophy and theology, and Lonergan started out kind of a big Newman guy, and he really liked Plato quite a lot early on, and he was a bit dissatisfied with the way that this is. He was born in 1904, so early 20th century. He's getting the kind of manual Thomist formation, intellectual formation those guys got, and he. One of the things he picked up from Newman really early on, that he pulled out a line from Newman as a kind of slogan, is this line about how 10,000 intellectual difficulties do not equal one doubt. And I think, and then later he would develop a kind of philosophy of knowledge in which he distinguished judgment, which involves saying yes or no to the truth of something, or later he would talk about judgments of value, which is a kind of yes or no to the value of something, from understanding, which concerns the kind of content of what's being affirmed. And he followed, later on, he followed Thomas Aquinas, really in thinking about faith in church teachings as being a matter of the form, or a matter of judgment. That we get a kind of what he called catechetical understanding, right? We get a kind of really kind of basic understanding of the sort that if you're an adult, you would have gotten in RCIA, or that you got in CCD, of what it is that the church says about these things, right? And theology for him begins when you say, all right, the church teaches these things from out of its authority, received from Christ through the apostles to teach on these matters. And so I'm going to affirm that it's true. And I mean, even something like the Trinity, which is hard to understand, in some ways you affirm it as true in a sort of way that says, I affirm it as true, whatever it turns out to mean, right?
Yeah.
I don't have deep insight into the Trinity,
Right.
but the church says it's true, so I offer the sort of Newman term is offer my assent.
Yeah.
But Lonergan says theology begins then when you go, all right, what does it mean, right? What does it mean to say that in a God that is infinite and eternal and unchanging and simple, to say that the Son proceeds from the Father? We say it every Sunday. How does that work? And I think in principle that applies really to all church teaching, not just the central dogmatic claims, but moral ones too. To be able to say, okay, the church has over time gone back and back and back to these sort of touchstone teachings, and that there can be a good faith, sincere and earnest raising of intellectual difficulties to say, okay, I affirm that what the church teaches is true, but I might not be sure that my understanding of what the church teaches is adequate to the truth that's being communicated. And part of, I'm maybe not a very good one sometimes, but I'm certainly trying to be a theologian. And part of our job collectively as theologians then is to try and engage in a collective version of that enterprise, right? To try and deepen our understanding. We're not changing what it is the church has taught or what Christ has taught or what the apostles taught, but we are always poking and prodding to make sure that collectively as a community we have as adequate an understanding of it as we can have on the basis of questions people have asked before and experiences of the church and the testimony of the saints and all these different sources that we use. Now I'm speaking sort of around your issue, but I think setting that baseline is really important to help clarify what folks are and are not doing when they raise questions about these really fraught, difficult issues. And I think we were talking a little bit before about one of the ways in which I got on your radar was you had bumped into Lonergan wrote a private letter to someone after Humanae Vitae was promulgated, answering sort of their own intellectual difficulties about the teaching. And I think in the early 90s, one of the Lonergan journals posthumously published this letter, which I always think is an important thing to remember. People will sometimes sort of trot this letter out to either hold up Lonergan on one side or the other of sort of culture war fights. But it was intended at the time as a private letter and was published posthumously. And he's really clear in the letter that he says, look, I have some criticisms of the kind of Aristotelian Thomist apparatus that's being used in Humanae Vitae to talk about what's going on. But he's also very clear that this should not be construed as him expressing doubt about the church's authority to speak on the matter, that what the church in fact teaches on the matter is true. All right. In some ways, he's not expressing skepticism about the doctrine per se, but about the sort of speculative apparatus that's used to try to deepen our understanding of the teaching. Right. He had pretty significant skepticism about the adequacy of kind of Aristotelian Thomist biology for contemporary moral theology.
Could I burden you to give maybe sort of a Cliff Notes summary of what that looks like, what the traditional Aristotelian Thomistic description of, let's say, our understanding of the marital act and its relationship to procreation, so that maybe we could better understand kind of where Lonergan was coming from?
Yeah, this is not especially my area, so I don't want to set any either any Thomist or moral theological hairs on fire, but the core issue that Lonergan sees really is a difference. It's really a difference between two ideals of what science does. On the Aristotelian Thomist model of science, it's about the reduction of contingent effects ultimately back to their necessary causes. And so the primary technique is a logical one. And so you have to have a kind of invariance, would be the word Lonergan would use, where think of like the syllogisms you learned in college logic class, maybe, right? Hypothetical syllogism, if A, then B, therefore, but A, therefore B. And those kinds of necessary universal logical relationships then are used as a heuristic, as a kind of framework or scheme to make sense of all different kinds of phenomena. Everything from the motion of the heavens to human biology, human and animal biology, even to human psychology, right? Human knowing and human willing and things like that. And Lonergan thought that one of the most significant, and in some ways underappreciated, transformations of what he would call modern culture was the emergence out of this older, what he called a classical ideal of science, a modern ideal of science, which has a different set of kind of expectations of what scientific knowledge will consist in. It involves observation, it involves experimentation, it involves not necessary and universal kind of logical relationships, but possibilities that are verified in data. And so what we learn if we take a 7th grade biology class or something is, yes, it's about the same subject matter that Aristotle and Thomas's biology of procreation investigates, but it's investigating it using, in some ways, a kind of different bag of intellectual tools. And in some ways, the counterintuitive thing that Lonergan saw in this shift in ideals is that the relative modesty of modern scientific tools, right, just possibilities that happen to be verified instead of logically necessary and universal causes, produced an explosion in human knowledge, such that modern life looks very different than not just medieval life or ancient life, but very different from early modern life. In a few centuries, things are, you and I are talking on video chat on wireless internet.
Right.
And again, I'm sort of talking around the main point here, but part of what Lonergan pointed out is that he saw in Humanae Vitae the use of the classical ideal of science to explain, for example, how insemination works. And the modern biological understanding is one that involves not universal and necessary causes, which need to hold in every single instance, but rather a set of statistical relationships that aggregate and accrue over a number of instances. Now, he doesn't say this, but I might. That could raise questions then about what openness to life means. Right? If we're talking about an aggregate of instances of sexual encounters, rather than the universal and necessary situation that happens in every single one, well, that might change our moral discernment, or at least raise questions about it. Again, I see you rolling the "do not take theological advice from us" thing.
That's our common thing. I just try to protect everyone. So
no, totally, and I'm actually being fairly careful not to sort of wade into making properly theological claims on the thing, mostly because I'm not an expert on that's not my area, so I don't want to get out of my lane. But these kind of more methodical, undergirding philosophical issues are my area, so I kind of want to stick to that. But anyway, I hope people find that a little bit helpful, or maybe it gives them some buckets to put their questions into.
My recollection of Lonergan, it's been a long time since I don't know if I read that letter or one of his other works. I remember this issue is the fact that saying that procreation is, let's say, inseparable from each marital act is in tension with the biological realities of how it works. Procreation, it's not like every time a couple has a conjugal act, procreation occurs. In fact, most of the time it doesn't, and there are all kinds of factors for why it can't: time of the month, health, and if you break it down to individual sperm, like statistically, it's almost it's such a mathematical amazement that it happens at all. And so my recollection is that that was what I took away from him is the way they understood the relationship between procreation and the conjugal act isn't really borne out and how things work. No.
Yeah, maybe another way of, I kind of went long-winded on it. Maybe a shorter or another way of thinking about it is, rather than being a kind of mechanical relationship, it's rather a kind of statistical one.
Yeah. Well, and so did he grapple at all then with the concept, I don't know if I'm using this right, the fundamental option, which as I understand, has more or less been condemned. But this is something that I have really struggled with recently, and actually commented on this on a live stream a few uh, episodes ago. But I was going back looking at our marriage vows. So in our marriage vows, we don't make a vow to have every conjugal act be open to life. What we have is we take a vow to be welcome children lovingly from God and raise them in the faith. Something along those lines.
Something in that area, yeah.
And there's this longstanding tradition or understanding that Humanae Vitae sort of recognize that there is something of a duty of couples to welcome children, bring children to the world in sort of a general context. But somehow all of our theology focuses on every distinct act, irrespective of how open the couple is to life, how many children they have, like, I'm not sure why that is, but there seems to be a tension or a disconnect there that seems to have developed along the way. And I don't know if he had any thoughts on that, or if you do. But
another Thomist kind of thing that Lonergan took up and would repeat often is that true and false are in the mind, which is to say they're abstract, but the good is concrete. And when it comes to moral questions, then the moral judgments expressed in a rule are abstract, right? They're which is precisely why they're capable to have the claim to be sort of universal and necessary, right? Because nothing concrete can be universal and necessary. Only a kind of abstract definition can be universal and necessary. And that means that the pivot between a rule and the actual moral good that you are obligated to effect in your life by God's intention, there has to be you have to discern the relationship between the rule and your concrete situation, which actually means like really three things. One is you have to understand the rule adequately. Two, you have to understand your moral circumstances adequately, right? You have to have a kind of realistic apprehension of your situation. And then you have to understand how that rule relates to your concrete situation. And so the idea that Catholic adherence to Catholic moral teaching is a matter just kind of following a set of rules, irrespective of concrete circumstances, frankly, I think sets people up to fail morally, because it treats the good as something abstract rather than something concrete. Mm-hmm. And actually, morality is much more demanding than just following the rules. Following the rules often can be, I think, psychologically for people, a relief because it contracts the moral task. Yeah, makes it smaller. Yeah, and so even though we have a lot of rules, and it can seem daunting to sort of keep up with all of them, and then trying to cram them onto whatever circumstance you're involved in, no matter sort of what it is, can seem eventually you can kind of run up against a limit on that. There's a psychological kind of palliative in just following the rules because it shrinks the moral task. The moral task is actually much bigger than that, which is that I have to sort of stay in touch with the nature of my moral circumstances in real time, all the time. I have to have done my moral due diligence, right, to have a kind of good moral formation. We talk about formation of conscience, right? Part of that means knowing what the moral expectations are in terms of the abstract rules. But then I have to discern in real time how to do the good that's incumbent upon me to do, and not upon a human being with a human nature, but on me, the person, this person who is an agent in this life that is unique and irreplaceable. I'm a big Mr. Rogers guy, right? So I like you made today a special day just by being you. There's no one else in the whole world just like you, right? The good that you are responsible for, no one else can do that for you, and you can't shunt responsibility for it off onto the rules. There's a real serious task of moral discernment. Now, that part of the value and the good thing about the rules, despite their abstractness, is that task is so enormous and so difficult and never ending until the day you're in your grave, that having the rules actually is a huge help. Right? Because now you're oriented, you have touchstones, you have a common point of discourse with other people as you seek out spiritual direction, for example. But that little Thomas slogan, "True and false are in the mind, but the good is concrete," I think can be a kind of antidote to the kind of rule-based rigorism that holds itself out as aspiring to a high moral standard, but is actually a kind of contraction of the moral task.
Yeah, I like how you put that, and that makes a lot of sense to me. And there was in my younger years, I felt exactly like that. The rules were liberating because and complying with the rules wasn't all that difficult. I found it actually much easier to comply with the rules when I was a single guy than I was a married person in the midst of the dynamics of life in this intimate relationship with another person. You become very different people when you have children, and then you throw just life becomes difficult to the point where it feels impossible sometimes for me to follow all the rules without just being an extreme, just eccentric weirdo that spends 3 hours a day in an ice bath to cool his body, right? Like yeah, I mean, if you throw enough at something, you can accomplish just about anything. But for most of us, that's not super realistic, and so for myself at least, and I know I'm not alone here, at times it feels like complying with the rules is nearly, like, practically speaking, impossible for me. So I'm picking my poison. Am I going to fall here or there?
And my point is that it's not even what's asked of you, right? That mere compliance with the rules is not, in fact, being morally good. Being morally good requires more than mere compliance with the rules. And there's one way of reading the Gospels that shows Jesus as bringing that message to his culture, right? That there was a whole scholarly apparatus and theological imperative that was, God's not going to deliver Israel from empire after empire occupying us until everybody gets on board with following these rules. And Jesus came and said, the kingdom of God is at hand, and my yoke is easy and my burden is light. But he also said, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. So now we're back to a question. Okay, how do those things fit together? Right? If the burden's really heavy and the yoke isn't light, there's some at least some praying to do, and some questions to ask, I think.
Yeah, and I distinguish, let's say, the Beatitudes, like the call to do that. Like, as I look at them, they seem like, look, and they're not even, I mean, maybe they're rules. They're rules in a little different way. Like, here's things I expect of you as a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Please do these things, and this will lead you towards a virtuous, saintly life if you can do it. But generally speaking, if I fall short of those things, it's not automatically a sin. Maybe I'm falling short of virtue, but I'm not necessarily sin. And if I am, let's say it's more of a venial sin. Whereas when you dip into this stuff, I know what the retort will be. They'll say, well, yeah, following the rules doesn't guarantee that you're good, but if you break the rules, it's intrinsically evil. It's gravely disordered. It's a mortal sin,
Right.
and you can't conscience your way around that. And so you simply cannot step into that space, because obviously committing a gravely evil matter, you can't do that. And that, to me, that is what I find so, I don't know, perplexing about Catholic sexual morality is we have these rules, like we have rules in other areas, but the price of disobeying those rules or not living up to those rules, at least according to the letter of the law, so to speak, doesn't seem to allow a lot of room for discernment and conscience.
Yeah.
And I don't know what to make of that. And I'm not suggesting you do either, but that to me is the real conundrum.
Yeah.
That
No, I
most
hear
of us
that.
deal with.
I hear that. And one of the things that one of the things too that I another of my hobby horses is that I'm a big believer. One of my favorite things in the Catholic intellectual tradition is this notion of evil as privation.
Mm.
That evil isn't a something, but it's the absence of a good that God intended to be there. And so sin, ultimately, sins. Now, look, these ways of speaking about sin sometimes are more practical than they are theoretical. But in theoretical terms, a sin isn't something that you do. A sin is a failure to do a good that God intended for you to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we look at what the church teaches in this area of sexuality, but really in any area of moral theology, I find it helpful for getting back to that distinction between judgment and understanding, in trying to understand adequately the sort of depth of what's being asked here, what's being taught here, to bring that understanding of sin to these things, so that our mentality as we come to it might be reframed away from how do I avoid doing bad things into how do I make sure I'm prepared to do the good thing that is expected of me. To know what it is, which is hard enough, just being in touch with in each moment, what is the good thing God has for me to do? But then if I know what it is, am I willing to do it? Am I prepared? Do I have the resources to do it? Am I showing up, with my hands full or my hands empty, so to speak? And now, look, does that sort of resolve this difficulty that sort of you're expressing? No, in part because the difficulty you're expressing is again a concrete matter of kind of discernment and figuring out what how to live faithfully as a Catholic in that space. But that, I mean, a beginning of a kind of platform from which to start, I would say, is that reframing of the moral task away from avoiding doing bad things to how can I be prepared to do the good things that I'm called to in each moment. And that's different. I mean, and then St. Paul's fitness metaphors suddenly become a lot more relevant, right? Right. Fitness. I like this Irish Catholic guy, a strength coach named Dan John. I like his stuff a lot. I came late to physical fitness and strength training and stuff, and his stuff has been really helpful. But he always talks about fitness as fitness for a task. Mm-hmm. And so to think about the moral life and as a kind of making sure you're ready, having your habits of prayer and your habits of worship and your habits in your relationships and your habits of self-cultivation and things like that as a kind of moral fitness training, so that as moral occasions arise, you're ready to do and prepared to do the good that you're called to. Now that can fill your hours too, but in a way I think that is more sort of literally more constructive than just viewing the moral life as a minefield that you have to navigate.
I mean, that makes sense from a mindset, point of view. I mean, I struggle with this as much more so in the past. I think I've kind of come around to things a little bit in my last few years, but it's when it's a much more attractive situation to be striving and trying to improve towards the good, as opposed to it feels like you're spending all your time just trying not to do the bad like that. I think that for a lot of us, it feels that way sometimes.
It's a hard way to live.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not the way to live.
Not to change the subject too much, but I wanted to bring full circle back to Lonergan a little bit, and then we kind of wrap up here. But so, and I haven't read his letter, but what? Correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially Lonergan more or less said, I don't dispute the authority and authenticity of, let's say, Humanae Vitae and the moral concepts that are promulgated there. I'm not. I assent to the church's teaching, despite my observations about, let's say, the methods that have been used in the past to support that teaching. Is that more or less right?
Yeah, that's basically it.
So I'm curious, and I don't know if you have any insight into this. Do you think that was a genuine perspective that Lonergan had, or do you think in some ways he felt that he couldn't just come out and say, I think Humanae Vitae is wrong or something like that? Do you think he genuinely, because personally, at least where I'm at right now, I share a lot of his like teleology and, that stuff seems less and less persuasive to me as a intellectual process for explaining things. Like the more I get it, the less satisfied I am that explains the reality. To me, it seems that the church's teaching is just, I don't know how you just take that out and the structure is just, no, we would have reached the same conclusions. We would have exact same teachings, even if Thomas Aquinas never existed. I find that, I don't know if implausible is the right word, but I'm not so easily persuaded that we would come up with this. To me, they seem to rise and fall together, and I suffer from more, I guess, internal skepticism of it, because I agree with what I think Lonergan is saying about these things, and I don't know. I may be just stating my position more than anything, but to me, that is something I personally struggle with, and I know others do too. Is like, well, okay, how else would they have come up with these rules if it were not for Thomas Aquinas's?
Yeah, no good. So, as to your first question about Lonergan, one of the points I pressed early on is that it was a private letter. And so I think that leans the direction of it's probably his authentic view. That I don't know that he was hedging for political reasons or something.
Yeah.
And that would be in line with his general kind of approach. He says in his 1972 book, Method and Theology, he describes himself as being theologically conservative, whatever conservative means, whatever that meant, and whatever that meant in 1972. But for Lonergan, it was always a matter, Lonergan saw one of Lonergan's criticisms of some anti-modernism was that it was ironically untraditional. That the tradition of the church has always been to engage the culture in which it's embedded. And to do so, he would have said dialectically. And what he means by that is that anything that the culture is generating, which is good, good old Augustinian pillage the Egyptians. And if there's stuff that's bad, you call it out for being bad. But this kind of wholesale, kind of root of all heresy stuff, he found to be a kind of divergence from the church's traditional engagement with culture. And for Lonergan, modern scientific developments are part and parcel with culture. It's a kind of cultural advance he saw. Now, again, doesn't mean to baptize every new scientific development as somehow good and awesome and excellent, but rather just to say that there's some significant intellectual progress have been made, and there needs to be, if that's going to be shepherded in a way that's good for humanity and good for the universe, that the church needs to lean forward into it and not sort of circle the wagons and plug its ears and sing Ave Maria really loud. And so now, consequently, what that can mean is that in light of new understanding, things, a deepening of understanding let me back up and approach this maybe a different way. My love for my wife is the same love I had when we got engaged in Austin, Texas in 2010. It's the same love. We're the same people. But like, we've lived in 3 different states since then, and we've had 3 kids. And it's deepened, and in that deepening has changed.
Yeah.
And so is it the same? Is it different? Well, I mean, that's like a philosophical problem, right? Sort of ship of Theseus stuff or whatever. But I think, I think Lonergan would say that there's a kind of value judgment. There's a deep level value judgment in there. I'm a little bit ventriloquizing Lonergan here. He doesn't come out and say it in these terms, but I think he would say something like this: that there's a deep level value judgment in there, say about openness to life or something like that. However you want to phrase it. But that the service of that value, we can serve that value better if we understand the sort of circumstances in which that value is realized better. And I think he seemed to think that advances in modern biology, because they were more in touch with, they grasped more of reality. They grasped reality better than Aristotelian Thomist
Right.
Biology. If the good is concrete, right? If the good is like in reality and not just in our minds, then understanding reality better puts us in a better position to serve that value. And so, yeah, it might change some of the details of our guidance about how to serve that value. But I don't think the judgment about the value would change, right? We wouldn't suddenly become anti-natalists as Christians.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's not going to happen.
Right.
The tradition that was saving babies from infanticide in the Roman Empire is not going to become anti-natalist. Right. And if it does, it's really abandoned something essential to its own moral vision.
Right.
But yeah, if modern biology helps us understand how it is that couples with a sexual relationship create children better, then we can be in a position to serve the value of human life and the rearing of children better. Another thing from Lonergan that I hope people will look at, if they are, let's say they're not as skeptical about teleology as you've become. Mm-hmm. There's an early essay he wrote called Finality, Love, and Marriage, where he hasn't so much moved into the kind of modern cultural horizon, and he's still operating within a very Thomist context. So if you have listeners or viewers who are still in that, or still, as if they're going to leave, but who for whom that's a convincing framework.
Yeah.
That essay is a very sophisticated, it's quite challenging, but a very sophisticated way of trying to do a kind of nuanced view of the place of procreation in marriage and in relationship with the ordering of both the man and the woman to God. Mm-hmm. It's really an impressive little thing. But it operates very much on a teleological model in a way that Lonergan, after he writes Insight and publishes it in the 1950s, he shifted into a kind of more modern scientific. He talks about, instead of teleology, he talks about it in terms of emergent probability and things like that. So his framing changes later on. But anyway, I hope I haven't totally lost the thread on the question you asked.
No, that is helpful, and that name rings a bell, and so that I'm thinking, even though it's been 25 years, that was probably one of the things that I read. But his main, when did he die?
83, 84, one of those years.
Was how much of his scholarly work predated Humanae Vitae? Was at 68, and how much of it was after? Was a lot of his stuff before Humanae Vitae?
The great bulk of it was really before.
Yeah.
Because he was, the thing that a lot of people haven't read he wrote a number of Latin textbooks that he used both when he taught for for a while at a seminary in Montreal, but then also he was at the Gregorian University for a while. And he's got marvelous these. I mean, they're in a kind of this older scholastic style, but if people are interested in that stuff, he's got a huge text on the Trinity, a couple different Christology textbooks that he wrote, and they're packed full of brilliant stuff. And not very many people read them, but we have them now in side by side Latin English facing translations. So if people want to go check that stuff out, but yeah, almost all that stuff was prior to 68. 68, Lonergan was a heavy smoker and he gave himself lung cancer. And so in the late 60s, he came back to North America and had a lung removed and then spent the rest of his life this side of the Atlantic.
Okay, that makes sense. Are these resources you're talking about, these old manuals, are they available like online on your website or something like that? Or
they have been. So my mentor Bob Dorn is the editor of the collected works of Bernard Lonergan. They're published at the University of Toronto Press. I'm sure that people can find this or that thing online if they poke around, but the critical editions are the collected works of Lonergan. They're very attractive volumes. They're all white with black and gold print on them. But we've got all that stuff collected. We've got a bunch of archival material all collected. I mean, if people want to dive down the Lonergan rabbit hole, my teacher Bob did yeoman's work in his life getting that whole set out. And so they're all published now, and I think they're all in print at the moment. So, and if people want other resources too, also they can go, they can check out. There's a bunch of websites. We have the Lonergan Institute's website at Seton Hall here, but there's also something called the Lonergan Resource, which is a website that Bob Dorn kept up to when he was alive.
So if I could take just a few minutes here, wrap up then. So in terms of what you do, like academically and with the institute, what's the purpose of the Lonergan Institute at Seton Hall? What's the objective, and where do you fit into that, and kind of what do you do on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, thanks. So we have right now we have two major things that we sort of generate, so to speak. We have a fall and a spring Lonergan lecture. And if you go to our website, we'll have information about those. And those are usually hybrid. So people, if they want to watch them online, they can. We have a wonderful theologian from Boston College coming down this fall who's going to talk about theology and science. She's both a cardiologist and has a PhD in theology. And then we also publish the Lonergan Review, which is a peer-reviewed scholarly journal, but it's really aimed at bringing Lonergan's thought in connection with professional studies, works in theology and spirituality. I mean, it's very kind of open in that way. And then, like I said, I'm still kind of new, but I'm hoping to set up more opportunities for people to be able to engage with Lonergan's work directly, reading groups, things like that. And this was started by Monsignor Dick Liddy, who was at one point the head of the Immaculate Conception Seminary here at Seton Hall. He's now retired, and so it falls to me. But we really look to keep Lonergan's intellectual resources out in the community as much as we can. In part because, I'm speaking for myself, though these ideas are often quite complex and quite abstract, I hope our conversation has shown the way in which they can be orienting on really difficult, complicated issues. They can help people get a grip on the sort of basic problems involved. So.
Yeah, for sure. No, this has been really helpful to me. Does Seton Hall then have a college seminary then?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's so we are one of just a few diocesan universities that are still around, and so the Archdiocese of Newark Seminary is here on campus. In fact, when I first came out here before my family moved out, they were very generous and they set me up in a room there for several weeks to save me some money. So I'm ever grateful to Monsignor Jerry McCarran for his hospitality.
So I assume then you're teaching some of the seminary. Are you teaching philosophy, theology, or both?
So I actually I do a little bit of teaching, but I teach in something called the core program here, which is sort of undergraduate. Yeah, liberal arts kind
Mhm.
of. I jokingly call it sort of liberal arts mishmash, but
Yeah.
it draws heavily on the Catholic intellectual tradition,
Mhm.
and it's really meant to be a shared
Mhm.
intellectual experience among all freshmen and sophomore students here.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay. Well, good. I'll link to your stuff below.
Oh, thanks.
If people want to follow more what you're doing, is there any particular additional resources or social media use that people can follow you and keep up with you?
Yeah. So the Lonergan Institute website is a good place to go. I'm a little bit negligent in updating that, but I'm hoping to be a little better about it in the future. And then I have a website as well, jonathanheaps.com. And I often will put, if I write non-specialist things, I have a page where I keep things in that zone updated pretty well. So.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate your time and willingness to talk to us. I found this very interesting and useful. Maybe we can do it again sometime. Okay. Well, thank you again. I appreciate
Yeah.
your
Thanks so
time.
much.
And so I'll wrap it up here. Thanks, guys, that were in the audience there. Thank you, Jonathan, for your time. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And until next time, everyone.